Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Over the past 12 months, much has been made about Donald Trump representing a break from the neoconservative and liberal interventionist worldview that has dominated U.S. foreign policy now for decades. But what evidence is there that a Trump presidency will actually mark a shift towards a less confrontational and less militarist foreign policy? We have just learned that Mike Pence will lead the Trump transition team, and he's closely connected to and considers Dick Cheney his mentor. Among those rumored for the position of Secretary of State in the future cabinet of Trump are U.S. Senator from Alabama, Jeff Sessions, and former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Joining us today to discuss what a future U.S. foreign policy may look like under Donald Trump and his rumored choices for Secretary of State is Gareth Porter. Gareth is a historian and investigative journalist and winner of the 2012 Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. He is the author of Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. Thanks for joining us, Gareth.
Thank you, Sharmini.
So, Gareth, what should we be expecting on the foreign policy front with this kind of a team that is being rumored at the moment?
Well, first of all, I mean, you have to begin with the reality that Donald Trump really has no background whatever in foreign affairs, has never really made an effort to study the subject, and doesn't have the kind of confidence that most presidents, most incoming presidents have had when they've started their time in the Oval Office. And that's a major problem here in terms of how his policy is likely to unfold. I mean, it means that he's either operating totally by the seat of his pants, or more likely he's going to be even more heavily reliant on his national security team than other presidents have been in the past, which is, of course, as we know, a great deal. And in fact, I've argued not just because it's an opinion, but based on the study of several histories of several presidents and their foreign policies, that in fact, presidents have over and over again had to compromise their own views in light of pressures from their national security team to do things such as go to war in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. So I think that's the first reality that we have to take into account. And then the second thing is that the people who have been discussed thus far as potential officials in his national security cabinet are not people who are associated in any fashion with dissenting views from those of the Bush administration, for example. That is, the neoconservative views of the hardcore team that was in charge of foreign policy during much of the Bush administration. So that combination of those two factors leads me to expect that we're in for a very bumpy ride. It's going to be a national security team, most likely, given the names that we've heard thus far, that is really more oriented towards the neoconservative viewpoint than even the Bush administration was, because in the Bush administration, there were realists anchored in the State Department under the Secretary of State Colin Powell and then Secretary Rice, who were pushing back against the neocons and in fact were successful in the second Bush administration. So I think this foretells a cast of foreign policy that is going to be fairly extremist.
Now, during the campaign, prior to Donald Trump choosing his vice presidential candidate to be Pence, he was asking for Kasich to be his vice presidential running mate. And at that time, Trump had said he could be the most powerful vice president ever. And now that we actually have Pence, and he's now been appointed to head up the transition team, and he considers Dick Cheney his mentor. Give us a sense of sort of the difference really between a liberal interventionist and what a neocon interventionist looks like in terms of foreign policy.
Well, the neoconservative cast of mind with regard to foreign policy is extremely heavy reliance on military power as a means of pushing U.S. Influence throughout the world. And of course, in the Middle East in particular, that's where they have chosen to focus their attention. They did focus their attention before and during the Bush administration. They were bent on the United States really occupying militarily a part of the Middle East sufficient to be able to project power throughout the region and essentially redraw the political map of the Middle East in order to essentially get rid of those regimes which were not playing ball according to the interests that they believed were desirable, that is US and allied, meaning particularly Israeli interests. And so it's really a very hardline, power-driven policy, which is not at all interested in democracy, despite the claims by neoconservatives that's what they're out to defend or to advance, but rather to advance a set of power interests that involve really reaching deeply into the Middle East with U.S. military power. It's an idea that has been completely discredited by the experience of the Iraq War. And it's astonishing that anyone in political life would continue to hold the idea that you could somehow have people associated with that viewpoint, such as John Bolton in particular, as a potential figure in the foreign policy of the United States. That is something that I certainly would not have expected, even with a very unfavorable view of Donald Trump.
Right. Now, before the election, Gareth, you and I spoke, and we were talking about the campaign rhetoric around tearing up the Iran agreement, for example. And so now here we are facing a Trump presidency. And what are your thoughts in terms of what Trump has been saying and the kind of people he's appointing or might be appointing? We are speculating at this point, and the viability of the agreement with Iran.
Well, Trump's views about Iran in particular, and the Middle East in general, I would say are very confused, muddled, not at all clear-minded. And what he has said is that he would basically tear up the agreement, start over again, and renegotiate it in a way that would be more favorable to what he regards as U.S. interests. That's, of course, a very unrealistic notion. It's simply not going to be feasible to do so. And, the question is whether the national security team that he names will have anyone on it who recognizes the infeasibility, the unrealism of such an approach. And at this point, the only name that I've seen who could potentially hold that position is Stephen Hadley, the former national security advisor under Bush, during the period when the realists were in fact more influential in the foreign policy of the administration. So if Hadley were, for example, a national security advisor, then there might be some hope of his warding off that kind of attempt by the Trump administration to rewrite the agreement. But at this point, one has to say that the chances of the administration beginning down that road are certainly very serious this is a very serious threat to the peace and to American interests.
All right. Now, turning to Syria, for example, and we also talked about Yemen not too long ago. Gareth, what do you think we can expect on the Syrian front?
Well, this is one of those issues where the president-elect has sounded at least more reasonable by suggesting that maybe it wasn't in the U.S. interest to try to overthrow the Assad regime, and seeming to renounce the tendency toward regime change that has been obvious in the Obama administration, but which President Obama himself seems to have been uneasy about over the last few years. So on that issue, again, I think that his views are somewhat muddled because he, on one hand, he wants to not be in the regime change business, but at the same time, he is calling for much more muscular U.S. military presence in Syria. And again, the question is whether he has enough confidence in his own judgment here to avoid being pushed in the direction of the direction that Hillary Clinton was headed towards, which is more U.S. military role directly against the Assad regime rather than the opposite. So, I think on that issue, we have a very unclear picture. There's still a very serious danger that he will be pushed in the same direction that Hillary Clinton was intending to go, and which President Obama clearly did not favor. And whether he would hold to the position that he has articulated, at least on one or two occasions in the past. And again, I'm simply afraid that somebody with his background, his lack of background in foreign policy, may not be able to stand up against the advisors who will be pushing him in the wrong direction.
Right. So let's assume that we have a Bolton as a Secretary of State. On the 24th of November last year, in the New York Times, he published an article that said, to defeat ISIS, create a Sunni state. In it, Bolton argued that an independent Sunni state must be created to act as a bulwark against Bashar al-Assad and the Iran-influenced government of Baghdad, the Assad government he's talking about. So if these guys are advising Trump is not going to be able to, carve out his own position here against the, many, many, many years of these foreign policy people like Bolton. So do you think that the policy will dramatically shift as a result of this in a place in Syria? Because right now the current government is also not supporting an Assad.
Well, I think all we can say at this point is that if indeed some of the names that have been bandied about and supposedly under consideration for top national security positions in this administration are in fact going to be given top posts, such as John Bolton specifically, then the risk of a confrontation between the United States and Iran, not just over Syria, but directly over the nuclear issue, is very great. And of course, John Bolton's biggest claim to fame is that more than anyone else over the past decade, he has been calling for bombing Iran repeatedly, both during the time he was in office and particularly since he's been out of office. He has over and over again been saying that the United States should bomb Iran and that Israel should bomb Iran. So he is the most dangerous figure of all, being considered for either a cabinet position or sub-cabinet position. But in the case of Bolton, I don't suppose he would settle for anything but Secretary of State at this point. And his nomination would certainly be a signal that we are headed towards a very dangerous confrontation in the future, at least a high risk of a dangerous confrontation with Iran. And the chances then of a policy that would be substantially different from what Hillary Clinton was in favor of, or would be, potentially even worse, would be very great.
All right, Gareth, so much more to unpack here, but I thank you for joining us today, and we'll keep having this conversation.
Thank you, Shamini.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.